What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for NFL Week 4 Final Look.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over each position and break down a couple of my favorite players for this NFL DFS main slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay guys, NFL Week 4, let's take a look at the quarterback position. So I like Josh Allen from the Buffalo Bills playing the Las Vegas Raiders, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and although they've been pretty good versus opposing quarterbacks, Josh Allen has averaged 35.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.3 rush attempts per game. This guy's been on fire. Every week I say, I don't want to play him. He had a big week last week. He's probably going to suck this week. But he's gone out there every single game. He put up 33, 38, and 36 fantasy points in the first 3 weeks of the season. Now, I know the matchup is not ideal here, so if you want to stay away from Josh Allen thinking this is going to be his down game, I totally understand that, but he's only going to be about 5% owned. This guy seems to be getting into the end zone every single week. He's projected at 24.6 fantasy points here in Week 4. He's 7,300 DraftKings salary and 1,300 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 52.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Bills favored by 3.5. So pretty close game. So I like Josh Allen here versus the Las Vegas Raiders. Okay, just real quick, I want to touch on this guy. He's only going to be about 1% owned this week. It's Lamar Jackson. I know he's the most expensive quarterback on the slate. He's had 2 bad weeks, only scoring 15 and 18 fantasy points in the last 2 weeks. Plus, the Baltimore Ravens are favored by 14 in this game, so you worry about the blowout where he's just going to hand the ball off and run out the clock. But I'm just saying, this guy had a couple of bad games. This guy's a top quarterback in the league. He can put up massive fantasy points. He could do it in 3 quarters. And he's only going to be about 1% owned. So I'm not going to be playing a ton of Lamar Jackson, but I am absolutely going to have a couple of Lamar Jackson lineups because this guy can go off. And if he does, you're sitting at 1% ownership and it's going to jump you ahead of the field. So with some caution here, I wouldn't go heavy on him, but I do think it's worth a shot playing a lineup or 2 with Lamar Jackson here versus the Washington football team. Okay, now 2 quarterbacks that are in killer spots here are Russell Wilson and Dak Prescott. I think both of these guys are in great spots here. They're about the same salary. Looks like Russell Wilson is 600 more on DraftKings. So Russell Wilson is a little bit more expensive. So just for the salary savings here, I think I'm going to go with Dak Prescott from the Dallas Cowboys playing the Cleveland Browns, who have the 10th worst defense overall, and they give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Dak Prescott has averaged 31.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 4.7 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 12% owned, projected at 27.6 fantasy points here in Week 4. He's 7,200 DraftKings salary and 1,000 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game here. 56 points scored in this game, with the Dallas Cowboys favored by 4.5. So you got a good matchup, a high-scoring game, relatively close and competitive game here. So I like Dak Prescott here versus the Cleveland Browns. Okay, moving down in salary. If you want to take a shot, save some salary at the quarterback position, take a look at Matthew Stafford from the Detroit Lions playing the New Orleans Saints, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Matthew Stafford has averaged 17.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 2.3 rush attempts per game. He scored 19 fantasy points last game. He's projected at 19.5 fantasy points here in week 4, and he's going to be about 6% owned. He's only $5,900 DraftKings salary, and he's $1,300 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 54 points scored in this game, and they have the Detroit Lions trailing by 3.5. So it could be, and it should be, a passing game script here for Matthew Stafford, who's got his weapons back. Kenny Golladay is back and healthy. This guy's got plenty of pass catchers to throw the ball to, so he could have a big day. So I like Matthew Stafford here versus the New Orleans Saints. And speaking of Drew Brees, I also like Drew Brees from the New Orleans Saints playing the Detroit Lions, who have the 4th worst defense overall, and they give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Drew Brees has averaged 18.8 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 24 fantasy points last week, and it looked like he might have Michael Thomas back for week 4, but now it doesn't look like that's going to be the case. Looks like Michael Thomas has been ruled out for week 4, but he can still get it done with the weapons that he has available. He's going to be about 7% owned, projected at 18.9 fantasy points here in week 4, and he's only $5,800 DraftKings salary, and he's $1,900 more on FanDuel. So I think this would be a DraftKings play for me, and Vegas thinks there's going to be 54 points scored in this game, with the New Orleans Saints favored by 3.5. So I like Drew Brees here versus the Detroit Lions. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. If you have the salary, because there's no Michael Thomas, take a look at Alvin Kamara from the New Orleans Saints playing the Detroit Lions, who have the 4th worst defense overall, and they give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Alvin Kamara has averaged 36.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 10.3 rush attempts per game and 10.3 pass targets per game. So without Michael Thomas, you're getting a running back and a wide receiver. He scored 48 fantasy points last game, 38 the game before that, 24 the game before that. He's going to be about 31% owned, and he's projected at 24.6 fantasy points here in week 4. He's $8,000 DraftKings salary and $800 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 54 points scored in this game, with the Saints favored by 3.5. Fantastic matchup. No Michael Thomas. He's the most expensive running back on the slate, but for good reason. So I like Alvin Kamara here versus the Detroit Lions. Okay, so this next running back pick is because DeAndre Hopkins, he's questionable. He's a game time decision going into this game in week 4 here. So if DeAndre Hopkins is out, I think Kenyon Drake becomes a must start. He is from the Arizona Cardinals playing the Carolina Panthers, who have a middle of the pack defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Kenyon Drake has averaged 11.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 18 rush attempts per game and 1.7 pass targets per game. So those pass targets could go up in a game that DeAndre Hopkins is not playing, and I'm assuming his usage rate or his touches most certainly will go up. He's going to be about 17% owned, projected at 16.7 fantasy points here in week 4. He's only $6,000 DraftKings salary and $1,000 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Cardinals favored by 3.5. So a high-scoring game, close game, it's a bad defense, terrible defense versus the run. So I like Kenyon Drake here versus the Carolina Panthers. Okay, and a nice value play here at the running back position is Mike Davis from the Carolina Panthers playing the Arizona Cardinals, who have a good defense overall, but they give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Mike Davis, he's averaged 12.9 fantasy points per game on the season. Now, he got 13 rush attempts last game and 9 pass targets. He's going to be about 24% owned, and he's projected at 16.6 fantasy points here in week 4. He's only $5,700 DraftKings salary and $600 more on FanDuel. So we know Vegas thinks there's going to be 51.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Panthers trailing by 3.5, but you don't have to worry about that with Mike Davis because he's getting 8 and 9 pass targets a week. So he's involved in the passing game. So even if they fall behind, he's going to be in the game plan. And he's got a nice matchup here versus the running back position. So I like Mike Davis here versus the Arizona Cardinals.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL, MLB is still going, NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
And another value play at the running back position is David Johnson from the Houston Texans playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the second worst defense overall, and they give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. David Johnson, he's averaged 13.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 11.7 rush attempts per game and 3.7 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 19% owned here because he's on the field for 90% of the snaps. He touches the ball 31% of that time. He's projected at 14.8 fantasy points here in week 4, and he's only $5,600 DraftKings salary, but he is $1,100 more on FanDuel, so I love that DraftKings price. Vegas thinks there's going to be 53.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Houston Texans favored by 3.5. So David Johnson got a great matchup here. He hasn't really had a breakout game yet. He did score 20 fantasy points in week 1. His volume is decent, getting around 15 touches per game, but he could get more here in week 4, especially if the Texans go up over the Minnesota Vikings. But it should be a high-scoring game. His salary is nice on DraftKings, so I like David Johnson here versus the Minnesota Vikings. And just real quick before we move on here, if you're looking for a low ownership running back who's got some opportunity, take a look at James Robinson and Darrell Henderson Jr. James Robinson is $6,500 DraftKings salary. He's $100 more on FanDuel. He's only going to be about 2% owned, and he scored 31 fantasy points last week and 24 fantasy points the week before that. And he's got a great matchup. The Cincinnati Bengals give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. So I like James Robinson because of the low ownership. If he gets you 20 to 30 fantasy points at 2% ownership, that's going to boost you ahead of the field. And then I also like Darrell Henderson Jr. from the LA Rams playing the New York Giants, who give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Darrell Henderson Jr. is averaging 14.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 11.7 rush attempts per game and 2 pass targets per game. But take a look at the last 2 games.
He scored 22 and 20 fantasy points off of 20 and 12 rush attempts and 3 pass targets in both of those games, so his volume is way up. He's only going to be about 3% owned here, projected at 14.9 fantasy points here in week 4, and he's $5,800 DraftKings salary, $600 more on FanDuel. Now, the reason that I think this pick is pretty good for week 4 is because Vegas thinks there's going to be 48 points scored in this game, and they have the Rams favored by 13.5. So this could be a Darrell Henderson Jr. running game script with a good matchup and low ownership. So I like Darrell Henderson Jr. here versus the New York Giants. Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. So it's just hard to get away from either playing Tyler Lockett or DK Metcalf. Both of these guys are in a great spot. They've both been averaging over 20 fantasy points per game. DK Metcalf with 7.3 pass targets per game. Tyler Lockett with 9.7 pass targets per game. Both of these guys are getting plenty of volume. Metcalf is going to be about 13% owned. Tyler Lockett about 16% owned. Both projected right around 17 fantasy points here in week 4. About the same salary. Lockett is $7,000 DraftKings salary, $500 more on FanDuel, and Metcalf is $6,800 DraftKings salary, $100 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 54.5 points scored in this game, with the Seahawks favored by 5.5. So I wouldn't play both of them in your lineup, although it looks like it's been working out. They've both been producing every single week, but I would pick one of the two and either go with Tyler Lockett or DK Metcalf here versus the Miami Dolphins. And another wide receiver that I like is Amari Cooper from the Dallas Cowboys playing the Cleveland Browns, who have the 10th worst defense overall, and they give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Amari Cooper is averaging 18.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 11.7 pass targets per game. So he's been really consistent throughout the first 3 weeks of the season, which is always why I didn't want to play him before, because he's kind of a boom or bust player. But he's been consistent through 3 weeks, getting a ton of volume. He's going to be about 15% owned. He's on the field for 88% of the snaps, touches the ball 17% of that time. He's projected at 16.7 fantasy points here in week 4, and he's $6,700 DraftKings salary and $400 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game, 56 points scored in this game, with the Cowboys favored by 4.5. So everything you want here in a wide receiver. Great matchup, high-scoring game. Well, they are favored, but not by much, only 4.5 points. So I don't think this game is going to get out of hand. Amari Cooper should get plenty of targets. So I like Amari Cooper here versus the Cleveland Browns. Okay, moving down in salary a little bit here, I like Tyler Boyd from the Cincinnati Bengals playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have the 9th worst defense overall, and they're middle of the pack defending opposing wide receivers. Tyler Boyd has averaged 17.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.7 pass targets per game. He got 13 pass targets last game, put up 26 fantasy points, and he's only going to be about 2% owned. I think because AJ Green is back, everyone forgot about how good Tyler Boyd is. And remember, AJ Green is sucking up that number 1 cover man, so Tyler Boyd is more likely to be open, getting a ton of volume. He's on the field for 81% of the snaps, touches the ball 14% of that time. He's projected at 14.7 fantasy points here in week 4, and he's $6,100 DraftKings salary and $100 less on FanDuel. So I like that FanDuel price. Vegas thinks there's going to be 49.5 points scored in this game, and we got a close game here with the Bengals only favored by 2.5. So I like Tyler Boyd here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. And if you're looking for a salary saver, this guy just seems like he's a little bit too cheap, but he hasn't really done much this year, so it's understandable. But I like Brandon Cooks from the Houston Texans playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the second worst defense overall, and they give up the third most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Now, Brandon Cooks, he's only averaged 7.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6 pass targets per game. He did put up 15 fantasy points in week 2, but week 1 and week 3, no good. He's going to be about 12% owned here, on the field for 76% of the snaps, touches the ball 14% of that time, projected at 11.2 fantasy points here in week 4, and he's only $4,500 DraftKings salary and $800 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game, 53.5 points scored in this game, with the Houston Texans favored by 3.5. So he's got a great matchup here. This guy has notoriously kind of underperformed, but it looks like the salary has dropped down so much, he doesn't need a lot to hit value, and he could put up a big game. So I like Brandon Cooks here versus the Minnesota Vikings. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. This guy is a tight end stud coming off of a bad game last week where he was a little banged up. I like Darren Waller. I think he bounces back here this week in a big way from the Las Vegas Raiders playing the Buffalo Bills, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Darren Waller has averaged 15 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 9.3 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 21% owned here, and that's mostly because he's on the field for 92% of the snaps. He's a huge part of the Las Vegas Raiders offense, touches the ball 15% of that time, projected at 14.6 fantasy points here in week 4. Vegas thinks there's going to be 52.5 points scored in this game, with the Raiders trailing by 3.5. So good matchup, high scoring game, passing game script. Oh, and he's $5,200 DraftKings salary and $1,500 more on FanDuel. So I like Darren Waller here versus the Buffalo Bills. And this is a guy I really like here in week 4. This is a gut pick here. I like TJ Hockenson from the Detroit Lions playing the New Orleans Saints, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. TJ Hockenson has averaged 12 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.3 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 5% owned, on the field for 72% of the snaps, touches the ball 11% of that time. He's projected at 11.5 fantasy points here in week 4. He's $4,800 DraftKings salary and $600 more on FanDuel. So I like that FanDuel price. Vegas thinks there's going to be 54 points scored in this game, with the Detroit Lions trailing by 3.5. This has been one of Matthew Stafford's favorite targets. He got 7 targets last week. So I like TJ Hockenson in a great matchup here versus the New Orleans Saints. And if you're looking to save some salary here at the tight end position, take a look at Logan Thomas from the Washington football team playing the Baltimore Ravens, who have a good defense overall, but they give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Logan Thomas has averaged 9.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8 pass targets per game. So he's getting great volume. He's only going to be about 5% owned, on the field for 83% of the snaps, touches the ball 14% of that time, projected at 9.3 fantasy points here in week 4, but he's only $3,500 DraftKings salary. He's $1,400 more on FanDuel, but I love that DraftKings price. Vegas thinks there's going to be 45.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Washington football team trailing by 14. so they should be passing the ball all game long here. So Logan Thomas could get a ton of targets. He's got a nice matchup versus the tight ends. So I like Logan Thomas here versus the Baltimore Ravens.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smickety smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again and good luck.